It's really a bittersweet moment that I have now to introduce our next speaker. I say that because Linda Luebbering has been an integral part of the lives of Missourians for years and years in the work that she's done and the various roles that she's played in state government. I've known Linda by name for a number of years, but I've known her by a working relationship for the last 5 years. And I've come to have a great respect for her and great confidence in what she does and the information that she provides. And I believe by working together that we've maintained a good appreciation for the challenges that she faces and that educators face across the state of Missouri. In fact, one time Linda worked in the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education as our budget officer as far as her work with the General Assembly. Linda is the Missouri State Budget Director for just a few more days, and that's the bittersweet part. Prior to her work in Missouri for Governor Nixon, she had worked as the Federal Management Director for her Fiscal Management Director for the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare for 4 years. She kind of took a leave from the state of Missouri and then returned, and we're so glad she did. But in total, she's worked 27 years in state government in various agencies. She has a master's degree in public administration from the University of Missouri, and she also has an undergraduate degree from that institution in economics. Do I need to tell you that she graduated with honors? Those of us who know her don't need to be told that. I've never seen a person who deals with as many things and knows everything there is to know about each one of them, and certainly a wonderful person. So Linda, if you'll come up. Before you make your presentation today, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education would like to make a presentation to you. In grateful appreciation to Linda Luebbering in recognition of your dedicated service to the citizens of the state of Missouri on the occasion of the 54th Annual Cooperative Conference for Missouri School Administrators, July 28th, 2015.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's really, I was very happy that this was going to be my basically last public presentation before I leave. I've been here, I think, every year since I've been back, and always surprises me that you asked me back, given some of the information I've had to share in some of the years that I've been here. But it's always been great to be here and to be surrounded by all this enthusiasm for the kids. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. We're going to look at the state budget situation. We'll start with looking at some of the economic news, and thankfully it has improved. So we're talking a little bit about that improving situation. Take a look at the state budget itself, our revenue situation, and kind of what lies ahead in the world of the state budget. So for us, as always, and I'll explain this a little bit later, why this is so important, but personal income, wages, and salary, very critical factors for us to look at from a state budget perspective. And as you can see, that downturn in 2009-2010, you can really see where we took that nosedive in personal income and wages and salaries at the depths of the recession. But you can also see that we have started to recover. There have been some bounces. You can see those ups and downs, but we're basically growing at, typical, maybe a little bit slow, but closer to typical rate in the 3.5% to 4% range in both of those factors. Unemployment rate certainly has improved. Those peak numbers for both the U.S. and the state of Missouri were close to 10% unemployment rates back in the depths of the recession, just under 10% for both of us. fallen quite significantly over the last few years, down to 5.5% for Missouri, just a little bit above that for the U.S. as a whole. So those unemployment numbers are certainly looking much better than they were. Flip side of that, current employment, not exactly the flip side because of the way they do these statistics, but close. Again, you'll see that improvement. You actually see those negatives during the depths of the recession. Practically never see those types of numbers, but we certainly did here in Missouri, as well as did the nation and other countries. We are back up to some growth here, the 1% range, a little bit above that at times, bouncing around again a little bit as we continue to recover, but certainly looks much better than it did. Taxable sales, now we've flipped over from the employment side to the sales side, and I'll explain a little bit more again later about why this is important to us. But total taxable sales are certainly starting to improve. Just like you saw with the employment numbers, we actually dipped down into negative numbers, so an actual decline in taxable sales during that recession. Have seen improvement in those numbers with the most recent quarterly data showing growth of 5.5%. Inflation, good news, bad news inflation. We have certainly seen low inflation compared to historical numbers, with inflation staying well below typical. We were at the most recent CPI, for example. You'll see that dip at the very end in that blue one, CPI. That's the effect of fuel prices going down so much. The CPI itself includes that volatile fuel and food factor. The core CPI excludes those, so that pink line, much more stable. Good news, bad news, CPI being low, one reason for that, or kind of a combination of factors, salaries are not increasing. So people are not seeing their wages go up. The inflation rate has been low. That has a negative effect on us from the standpoint of our major source of revenue for the state of Missouri. Good that it keeps prices down, but a little bit of inflation is actually much more normal than what we have been seeing. Kind of just a reminder about where our money goes in the state of Missouri, and here's where I will stop and say I'm mainly focusing on general revenue. So for all of those of you out in school districts, you know you have your main sources of money going into a general type of fund. This is our general revenue fund. It is money that is not earmarked for specific purposes, so it can be used broadly for any purpose. And you can see by the pie chart that elementary and secondary education is the largest, has been and continues to be the largest slice of that general revenue pie at 36% or $3.2 billion for the current year, fiscal year 2016, which started on July 1st. The second big slice there, human services, is a hodgepodge of lots of things, including our health care services for low-income seniors, people with disabilities, otherwise known as our Medicaid program. We're flipping to all funds just so you can see this. Typically, I won't talk about all funds, but this includes federal funds and earmarked funds for state purposes like highways. So on this chart, the difference really is transportation shows up. Transportation in the state of Missouri funded through a dedicated tax, so they weren't on the previous chart, but they're on this one at $2.2 billion. And then elementary and secondary education shrinks, and that human services segment grows, and that's largely due to federal funds. Federal funds coming to states are almost all about Medicaid programs. Yes, schools get a little piece of federal money, but relative to the size of Medicaid, it's very small. So when we look at our overall budget and federal funds, that Medicaid or human services pie becomes a much bigger piece of the overall puzzle. This is Department of Elementary and Secondary Education more specifically. If you look at that $3.2 billion in general revenue, where is that going in 2016? Largely the foundation formula at $2.8 billion in general revenue. Other sources go there as well, but the general revenue portion of the formula at 2.8. You then see other segments there, special education, the board-operated schools. Other includes just a whole host of things, including the assessment program that was discussed earlier. And this was last year's. You can see basically it's grown by $100 million, most of that in the foundation formula. I'm going to skip those and let's go to the state revenue side. So going back to my early statement about why we care about those salaries and wages and personal income in employment and unemployment, it's because of this chart. Our general revenue collection, 68% from the individual income tax. So if people are not employed, if unemployment is high, if wages are low, our largest source of revenue is not going to do well. That segment of the general revenue budget has grown as a percentage over time, not because it's getting bigger, but because everything else is shrinking. Corporate, for example, our corporate tax, 5% now, used to be a larger, more significant piece of the puzzle, but a lot of tax policy changes. That piece of the pie is changing because of various tax reductions that we've seen in the state of Missouri. Sales tax shrinking as a portion of the overall pie, mainly because of the reality of our economic world. Internet sales becoming more important, and so that piece of the pie is shrinking a little bit relative to where it would have been without those changes. I like to show this one because it is the good news, bad news piece of our general revenue budget. It is improving. So our general revenue collections are improving, absolutely. You can see that orange line. We are seeing some growth in our revenue collections. But we are not seeing those numbers get back to where they would have been in a normal cycle. So that blue line is basically actual revenues through 2008. And then hypothetically, if we would have grown by our standard 3.5%, not super growth, but normal growth of 3.5%, where we would have been at this point in time. So we would have grown during that time to about $10 billion in general revenue. Instead, we're at 8.7. So yes, we have seen some growth, but when you're wondering why we haven't seen the investment, the increases in some things like you would normally expect to see, it's because we really have this huge gap between where we would have been and where we actually are now. So although we are seeing some growth over time, not enough to really see the same level of investment that we would have seen. That gap at about $1.5 billion, the gap got bigger last year, but I think that was an anomaly. That $1.5 billion gap between where we would have been and where we are is kind of holding steady. General revenue as a percent of personal income. We look at this for a number of reasons. One is the burden on taxpayers of our tax system. Missouri has always ranked very good from the perspective of there's a lot of room between where we do tax and where we could and not have a burden on our citizens. So general revenue as a percent of personal income has dropped from about 4.5% down to this 3.3% number, meaning that we're collecting less of people's income into the state of Missouri. For those of you who've been around state government, this was important at one time because of the Hancock Amendment. If we collect too much relative to personal income, we actually have to write taxpayers a check. We don't have to worry about that right now. We're close to $4 billion below that level. So 5.6% is where we can be, which would be about $4 billion higher than where we are right now. Tax credits. Tax credit redemption really have been important. We're more critical during that economic downturn because in the depths of that downturn, we saw a couple of years in which tax credits really skyrocketed above where they had been, which caused a worse revenue problem for the state. They've kind of settled down, and we anticipate they'll kind of stay at that level for a while, so not as erratic as they were during the economic downturn. So kind of current status, where are we and where are we headed? General revenue, that GR, their general revenue, in fiscal year 2014, so that is the year that started in July of 13 and ended in June of 14, revenue collections actually dropped by 1%. That was a surprise for us. It was a surprise for most states who had that happen. But in kind of hindsight, that was largely driven by federal tax policy and people trying to work their taxes owed, and so they paid taxes early instead of later, and it really pulled revenue out of that 2014 year. 2015, the year that just ended on June 30th, our general revenue collections were up 8.8%. A really good year. But we, like most states, are seeing this up and down, bouncing all over the place. So we had a bad 12, a good 13, a bad 14, a good 15. We're hoping that we don't see a repeat of a really bad current year, fiscal year 16. Of that 8.8%, the really good news is on the individual income tax side, up 10%. Sales tax, not so good, at 3.3. Corporate was a surprise, up 10%. Sales taxes we're going to be watching. We've continued to see a couple of factors here. People are still not secure in their situation, and so they're not spending. The savings rate is up, continues to be up. And you do have the continuing impact of internet sales as people buy more and more over the internet, which are largely not taxed. Some of it is, but largely not. You're going to continue to see a depressing factor on sales tax collections. For fiscal year 2015, the year that we just ended, we needed 10% growth to make the budget work. And that was largely driven by the fact that the prior year was so awful. Our base was bad, so we needed 10% growth from that very depressed base to make fiscal year 2015 work. So we got to 8.8%. That's wonderful, but it's not 10. So we did have to have some expenditure restrictions in place at the end of the year. For the year that just started, July 1, so July 1, we're in fiscal year 2016, we are estimating that we need growth of about 2%. In order to avoid expenditure restrictions. Should be doable, but given that we had 8.8% last year, given that we've been bouncing up and down, we're going to have to watch that very closely to make sure we get to that level. So we will be monitoring the situation. It's possible that we'll have to do governor's restrictions later in the fiscal year, and I keep saying we, even though it won't be me, but the budget director and the governor will need to look at that later in the fiscal year. Future outlook, we really should start to see some improving and continued improvement, but we do have a couple of factors that we have to watch closely. Senate Bill 509, for those of you who were involved in all of that discussion, will go into effect in tax year 2017. So that is our state fiscal year 2017, or the upcoming budget. We will start seeing the impact of those tax cuts. So that will phase in over a number of years. It will have some impact. How great, we don't know, but certainly some impact. We'll be monitoring that. Do believe that that's going to dampen that growth, so we'll see a little bit lower growth because of Senate Bill 509. We do have a situation in fiscal year 2017 caused by a couple of one-time things going on in the current year. That's where we've got one-time revenue sources, tax amnesty. We are going to be granting Missouri taxpayers an amnesty period to get caught up in their tax payments. It's good to do that every once in a while, but those funds were assumed in the budget and they won't be available then again next year. So those will create a little bit of a problem. I think the international situation is really more critical right now to the U.S. than what's going on here. We've got the situation in Greece and Puerto Rico. I don't have China up there. It could actually be the biggest issue of all. And you're seeing the stock market right now bouncing around because of news coming out of China. So we really don't know what impact that's going to have on the world economy. So we are anticipating continued growth, but depending on what goes on internationally, we may see some ups and downs continuing for a few years. Going back to Senate Bill 509, which will start to impact in 2017, estimated impact of that is $621 million when it is fully phased in. That's an estimate. That's the estimate by the Legislative Fiscal Office. It could be higher, it could be lower. We just have to wait and see. There have been a couple of other changes that will impact our revenue. Tax on franchise, for example, will be completely eliminated. For this group, just very quickly, I always like to mention lottery and riverboat. In Missouri, lottery proceeds and riverboat gaming proceeds are earmarked for K through 12 education. So like to mention that here. Both of them are seeing economic or demographic changes, I should say, more than anything. Younger folks don't go into gas stations and buy lottery tickets, and they don't go on riverboats and gamble. And that's a good thing. You're teaching them good stuff. They understand the odds of winning are not in their favor. But it does reduce the revenue that we have dedicated to education. We will need 10% growth to get to the lottery target for the current fiscal year. That is not going to happen. That's why one prediction that I'm pretty much guaranteed is going to come true. So there will be some shortfall in lottery revenue. Riverboat, we did pull that estimate down in the budget. The legislature was willing to pull that estimate down. So we only need 2.5% to get to that riverboat gaming number for the current budget year. That is possible. So hopefully we won't see as much of a shortfall there as we have in recent years. Bright spots, I'd like to talk about this just a little bit from a budget perspective, not from a policy perspective, but purely from a budget perspective. Medicaid expansion actually would save the state of Missouri general revenue because we would get federal funds to pay for services that we're currently paying for with general revenue. That would free that money up for other purposes like education. It will require a federal change to really do anything about that internet sales tax issue. So will Congress or won't Congress do anything to allow states to collect sales tax on internet sales for businesses that are not located in those states? Possible, there's been a lot of discussion, but we don't think there's any immediate solution in the immediate future. We ought to see continued economic growth, but some of that's going to depend on what goes on, as I said, internationally. So with that, happy to take questions if anybody has any. I don't see any, so just again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's been my pleasure to be here. Basically, they have invited me back every year I've been back here in Missouri, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you at each of these, and wish you all the best in the future. Thank you.